Hello. Well, it's great to see the limited amount of people that are here, and I want to thank all the song leaders and the musicians. They're great. They've really done a lot as we've been in quarantine, and they've really I think they've helped connect us to one another through the music and everything. A song like that, which is so beautiful. You got to understand, if you're here, you would see me off to the side. I'm not sure when to get up on stage in a song like that. There's a lot of false endings there, and so I'm coming in and off the stage and making a buffoon of myself. I'm glad that didn't get on camera, hopefully. But it is great to be together in this limited way, at the very least. It's been somewhat interesting preparing for these limited in-person services because there's temperatures to be taken, there's masks to be on, there's social distancing. We're the worst group in human history at social distancing. And so it's just so difficult for people not to hug and touch one another. And we've not seen each other for so long, but it is a joy at least to see some people here. Now, the original poll that we gave out about a month and a half ago to the church suggested that as soon as there was any sort of limited opening to meet in church, that there was an overwhelming desire to meet together. And so we've been preparing for that for a month. Now, in the last month, many things have changed in the world, and there's a lot of new news, and you know, the pandemic has a bell curve, and it's going up and down all the time. And I think the interest for meeting together in a limited way has waned since we originally took the poll. And so we may have to go back to just church at home for a little bit until some of the regulations lift and we really can start meeting together. But this is good practice for us in the meantime. Now, in the month of July, we've been doing a series called Generation to Generation. Many movements and ideologies and organizations fail because they cannot pass the torch from one generation to the next generation, those foundational principles that they began with. What are some of the most important things that we need to learn if we're going to pass on a legacy of faith to the next generations after us? And that's what we've been looking at this entire month. Now, one of the books that most informed my view on leadership when I was young in the ministry was not an overtly spiritual book. It's a book entitled Walking with the Wind. And it's a memoir of the student and youth movement of the civil rights in the 1950s and the 1960s. Specifically, this book told the story of SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And, these were college students. It tells the story of these college students that were the front lines for all the sit-ins and demonstrations that took place during that time. Their commitment to peace was in every way a derivation of Jesus' teachings. They would conduct highly planned demonstrations where every participant was trained in Reverend Lawson's kind of doctrine of nonviolent protest. And they consistently got the worldwide press to show up at their demonstrations to witness kind of their discipline and their commitment to this cause. And it was then that many of the sages and the communicators of the movement, like Dr. King, would then have a wider audience to talk to the country about what they were doing and why they were doing it. SNCC was instrumental to those extraordinary times, and it was young people doing much of the heavy lifting. This book is both inspiring and cautionary to me, because the author showed both the success and the failure of the legacy within the civil rights movement. Walking with the Wind warned of the pitfalls of not passing on the ideals and the vision of any movement to the next generation. The book was prophetic in so many ways. And today we're going to examine one of those pitfalls of generation to generation failure. Now, the title of today's sermon is When Worlds Collide, When Worldviews Collide. Every generation experiences life differently because they live through different worldwide events, obviously. And this means that each generation usually has a different worldview than the one before or after it. Learning to understand these differences and accept them is key to a lasting legacy. Now, symbols have always interested me. They represent ideologies sometimes. Sometimes they represent organizations. Sometimes they represent beliefs. Now, I'm going to show you a symbol right now that's important to me, all right? And this is the symbol of the phoenix, okay? You will find this symbol on the back of my car. It is a type of phoenix, but this particular phoenix represents something other than mythology. It is the symbol of the Liverpool Football Club. Go ahead and go to the next symbol. The greatest soccer team on the planet, all right? Everyone of discerning judgment and who loves what is good and right would agree with me on this. Except for maybe these guys. Let's go ahead and show the next slide. These guys may not agree with me, all right? You have Manchester City, Manchester United, and Barcelona. And, last year, Liverpool absolutely embarrassed Barcelona in the championship semifinals. And so these guys have a different viewpoint on the Liverpool symbol. To those people, the symbol that I love represents something different. My symbol represents something bad to them. Now, they're wrong, of course, but their different perspective is the point of today's message. Now, what happens if we turn the symbols into something else that doesn't have to do with sports? Because sports is fun, it's somewhat trivial. What if we use different types of symbols? What if we use the symbol of Democrat and Republican? Well, when we do that, boy, it's funny how quiet it gets very quickly. Everyone gets a little uncomfortable, like what's he going to say? The assumptions and the absurd leaps of rationale that people make about one another once they discover someone else has an allegiance other to their own symbol is stunning in its folly. And some of these assumptions are rooted in the issues that we need to discuss today, because these symbols have come to stand for different worldviews to the minds of many. And what happens when worldviews collide, especially between generations? There's a great deal of assumption that goes into everyday life. Like, you have to make assumptions every single day. It's unavoidable to any degree to not make assumptions. Our brains are always making shortcuts so that we can think efficiently and quickly, relying solely on the information that is contained within each unique mind. Of course, one cannot take into account what's in everybody else's mind, right? And what doesn't exist in one person's mind? Well, the entirety of what exists in every other person's mind on the planet and their unique position to that information. In other words, each of us, while containing an almost improbable amount of information, still exists in such a state of ignorance, it's almost a miracle that we can survive in such a brutal world. Each of us, regardless of whether you might think it's right or not, makes judgments and assumptions in order to live without being in a constant state of analytical paralysis. Now, most of these assumptions that we make from day to day are completely innocuous. For instance, when you pull into your garage, you are approximating the size of the garage in relation to the size of your car and the speed with which you're pulling in. You don't know any of that information exactly. You're making assumptions about that information. And it's usually okay. If you're a decent driver, you could pull into your garage and out every single day making those assumptions. Sometimes you jump over a puddle in order to protect your new kicks, right? You calculate almost unconsciously the amount of energy you need to cross the distance of the puddle, which also, by the way, you unconsciously determined. All right? These are all innocuous assumptions. Sometimes, maybe you find yourself on a Zoom call one time, and you're looking at someone else on the Zoom call, okay? And they are scrolling through their phone while you're talking and seemingly disconnected from what you are saying. And so you are assuming that they're not listening. And by the way, they happen to be young, the person that you're looking at. I mean, yuck. It's this last example of assumption that sometimes gets us into a little bit of trouble when we're talking about generational worldviews. For people of my generation, Generation X, the best generation since the greatest generation, that sort of visual of someone looking at their phone, not paying attention to you, seems very clear in what it means. Because to my generation, it means that this young person is not paying attention in one of the most blatant and rude displays of their own self-importance and entitlement. Wow, that felt good to say, by the way. That felt awesome. It was almost cathartic that I got that out. Thank you, everybody. But the thing is, it might not be true. This visual, in fact, may represent a difference in worldview between generations. For a generation that has grown up in a connected age, the idea of listening intently while also doing something else digitally may not carry the same connotation of disrespect and indifference that it once did to my generation and pretty much all the generations before mine. Disrespect and indifference looks different sometimes. And sometimes we make some mistakes by the assumptions we make. We need to be careful about the assumptions we make when we're dealing with different generations. This is imperative to passing on a faith legacy. I remember one time when Megan and I were in college, we weren't Christians yet. We were dating. We'd been together for a while, and one summer there was a free concert going on in the town where we lived, the city where we lived, and it was a Glenn Miller cover band. Okay, now if you guys don't know who Glenn Miller was, he's like a big band. In the Mood was his biggest song, but he was I think in the 30s and 40s. There was no musician bigger in the U.S. than Glenn Miller, perhaps. And so they had a big band that was doing some of his covers. And Megan and I thought it would be fun to go because I can remember going to my grandparents' house growing up and them playing Glenn Miller in the background. So I thought let's go to this free concert because I don't have any money. And so we went to this concert. Right away, we knew that we were going to stand out in this concert because there was nobody else at the concert that wasn't younger than 60 years old, okay? So a lot of older people, loving Glenn Miller and that music at this outdoor concert, and then Megan and I. And Megan, who's beautiful, and everybody loves Megan, no one has a problem with Megan. At the time, I played in a band. I played in a college band, and I only bought clothes from the thrift store, and so I had long hair, earrings, thrift. I looked homeless, and so I walk into this with my girlfriend, and we're watching this Glenn Miller band. And it's a beautiful day. We're enjoying ourselves, and as the music was playing, at some point during the concert, I started to look up at the amphitheater, and I noticed that there were strips of plaster blowing in the breeze that were about to fall off, and I was just kind of entranced by when it was going to fall off. And then all of a sudden, one piece of plaster fell off, and it almost hit somebody in the crowd, but it didn't. But I was like, but there's more that's coming. And so this became a game for me to watch this plaster. And then one piece of plaster wasn't heavy, but it came down, and it landed on this poor old lady's head. You know what I mean? And then there was like a mushroom of dust, like an atomic bomb of plaster and hairspray, just intermixed and created some sort of antimatter reaction, you know what I mean? And I just started laughing, and she was like 100 feet away, and obviously she was very startled, and she starts looking around, and she turns around, and we make eye contact, and I'm sitting there laughing, and so immediately she elbows her husband, and they start pointing at me, and this whole row of older people start turning around and looking at me. They start getting up and having other conversations with other old people at the concert. And before you know it, there is a gang of old people coming after me. I was like, babe, we got to go. I don't know what these guys are going to do to us. And we had to leave. They made an assumption about me. Now, I was laughing, sure, but I think their assumption was only bolstered by the fact that, number one, I was young. I didn't dress probably the way that they liked, and that I had long hair. And so I very easily became the enemy in this situation, though I had done nothing wrong. Now, this is a funny example, but I think interactions like this are happening inadvertently all the time between the generations, where we make assumptions about one another. Now, the mistake isn't that you don't understand one worldview or another. That is going to happen. Unless you happen to be omniscient, you are going to misunderstand other worldviews. Those that maintain that such mistakes are a result of some kind of bigotry or prejudice simply haven't had a very wide exposure to the thousands of different cultures and worldviews that presently exist. They have a parochial understanding of how big and wide and deep the world is. No, the mistake is when people assume they understand another person's worldview. The mistake is believing that your worldview is the correct worldview. And a lot happens to make real differences in worldviews between one generation and another. A few years ago, I was thinking a lot about 9/11. And, in 2001, there still existed a pretty good contingency of the World War II generation, the baby boomer generation, and the Generation X generation, all right? And, to my grandparents, my grandfather fought in World War II in Korea. 9/11 was just one more of the horrific events in the line of many others that took place during World War II and the Korea War, such as Pearl Harbor, Iwo Jima, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, concentration camps, and the 25 million who died in the Soviet Union under Stalin. To them, 9/11 was another evil event that must be responded to with quick and decisive force. That was their worldview because of what they had lived through. To my father, who was a helicopter gunner during Vietnam, 9/11 was seen a little bit differently than his parents' generation. 9/11 was another confusing and painful reminder that we as a country are not invincible. The actions that followed in Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11 and some of the failures therein underscore the painful truth that we're not always correct in our assessments and our application of decision making. Yet his generation is more divided about that concept, and there are many tensions within that generational cohort as a result. Now, to my generation, 9/11 was the first real terror we'd ever experienced. Besides the exceptional few of us that had served in the military, most of us had been cozily insulated from the horrors of things like the Khmer Rouge, Rwanda, the Middle East, to name a few. Therefore, 9/11 was as close as we've come to real danger. Even so, we did not even consider the danger of a draft something that was even going to be possible during that time. The danger was not even war itself, really. War, such as my grandfather and my father fought, were brutal realities of the distant past now. War is different today. What we feared was why. Why are we hated? Why do we not care that we're hated? The danger was not in trying to answer those questions. The danger was also what the real answer to those questions was. And now my son, when he goes to school, he learns about 9/11 from a teacher that wasn't yet even in the first grade when it happened. 9/11 is as distant from their young teachers as Vietnam is to me. We'll all see the world differently based on the history we actually experience. My grandparents' worldview is quickly disappearing from our culture. Because if you fought in World War II at this point, you're 90 years old. In 10 years, there'll be so little that remains from that worldview that it will just be a footnote in history. The people that are here with us today and who are watching online, if you are between the age of 50 and 64, you make up 19% of the total U.S. population. My age group, 35 through 49, we make up 20% of the U.S. population. The next age group, 18 through 34, makes up nearly 25% of the U.S. population. Now, neither group has a better, more effective, or correct worldview as a whole. But what we have to understand is that they've all been informed differently. No one can claim a purely objective worldview. Every single one of your opinions and views on life has been informed by the circumstances of your whole life. All of those circumstances influence how you see every single issue. The very reason this is important is because of a common goal that we all care about. David wrote about this goal and referenced it in a couple of his poems. Psalm 78, 1 through 8 says this: "My people, hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth with the parable. I will utter hidden things, things from old, things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their descendants. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders that he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach their children, so the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God. They would not forget his deeds, but would keep his commands. They would not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation whose hearts were not loyal to God and whose spirits were not faithful to him." Psalm 71, verse 17 through 18 says this: "Since my youth, God, you have taught me, and to this day I declare your marvelous deeds. Even when I am old and gray, do not forsake me, my God, until I declare your power to the next generation, your mighty acts to all who are to come." You know, both of these poems are about a similar ambition: the desire and the commission to pass on the faith to the next generation. Now, some aspects of this desire are innate. It's called legacy. At some point in life, legacy becomes important to us. It's a little different for everybody, but at some point, for most people, legacy becomes something that drives them. And when the impulse to leave a legacy becomes apparent within us, it soon becomes strong within us as well. Pass along what is important so it doesn't die with us and it does not die with our name. We all come to the faith in different ways. We all stayed faithful to God in differing ways. And yet, where there is dramatic commonality in our stories, we usually find important principles that we teach. Sometimes those principles are for all time. Sometimes they are for a people of a specific place or a specific time. And sometimes they become a stumbling block to the next generation. It's part of the reason that we sometimes find these deep silences and distressing gaps in the biblical narrative of God's people and their collective faithfulness. Gaps where God is silent. Gaps where there are no deeds of wonder. Between Adam and Noah, between Noah and Abraham, within the time of the judges, between the prophets and Jesus. Legacy sometimes failed within those silences. And part of the reason, though never the entire reason, is because generational worldviews were colliding, and in the aftermath, the faith was largely abandoned by the people. Though never abandoned by individuals, perhaps, yet collectively lost for a time. We have such issues brewing right now in our own era. Never before in my life have I seen such a hunt and destroy mentality exist within the public consciousness for those who dissent or disagree or object. Never have I experienced or seen people labeled, disregarded, and thrown into the camp of an enemy so casually and with such consistency because they might question or disagree with debatable or confusing topics. And never have I personally felt so acutely the distrust that one generation has for another. It's the perfect climate for the destruction of legacy. In the Bible, that ending was sometimes heralded long before the actual demise occurred. One of the best biblical illustrations of that shows this well and has everything to do with generational failure and the collision of worldviews between the generations. Go ahead and open your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 12. We're going to be looking at King Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon. Rehoboam came into power and immediately was approached with complaints, okay? And in verse 1 of chapter 12, it says, Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, he returned to Egypt. Now, just really quickly, just so you know, Jeroboam was a bit of a thorn in the side for Solomon, all right? Jeroboam was both right and wrong in some of his observations. He was sometimes right in what he thought, and he was often wrong in his application of that thought. Solomon couldn't stand him and chased him away. So when Solomon's son comes into power, Jeroboam goes, well, this guy is not nearly the threat that Solomon was, so I'm now going to come back and see if I can solidify a base of support. All right? So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, so you got to understand, Jeroboam is back from exile. He gets a bunch of people to go to get together. He goes, hey, Rehoboam, we got some questions for you that we think you need to answer. All right? Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. Rehoboam answered, go away for 3 days and then come back to me. So the people went away. Now Rehoboam's a young king. He's coming into his own, and this is his first kind of debate. This is his first community disagreement. And they're coming to him and say, hey, your father had all these building projects, of which Jeroboam used to be kind of the foreman over. And he used to tax us and make us work in the northern kingdoms for the southern kingdom projects. We want you to lessen the load. All right? We don't want to be coming down from the north all the time to build your stuff in Jerusalem. And so Jeroboam says, all right, give me a few days to think about this. And probably wise, I'm sure as a young man, he's a little bit heated. He's like, these guys are just trying to take advantage of me because I'm new. I'm a young king, and so they're trying to walk all over me, right? They're testing me right now. So what he does is he goes to his elders, the older men, and he goes, you guys see this? What should I do about this? And the older people go, well, I think you should give them a favorable answer. Tell them that you will lighten the load, and they'll love you. Tell them that you'll be their servant, and they will love you. Now, Rehoboam's like, I'm not doing that. This is my first day on the job. I'm not going to all of a sudden be a servant, all right? I've been waiting to be king. So then he goes to his buddies. He goes to the young men. He goes, hey, you see these guys? What should I tell them? And the young men said, you go back and you give them the business. You tell them that your little finger is thicker than your whole father's body. You tell them that if they complain, you're going to make it 5 times worse. So that's what he does. Then Jeroboam, and when he receives the answer from Rehoboam, goes, guys, I think we got our answer. We're out of here. We are no longer a part of your nation. And there was a civil war, and the nation divided. All right? He consulted the elders, but he didn't like what they told him. He consulted the young people. The young people told him exactly what he wanted to hear, and he followed up with that. From that day on, the Bible would refer to Judah and Israel, sometimes called Ephraim, as separate nations. Something was lost forever because of what happened between these 2 generational cohorts. God's people would remain sundered for all time. Much of Israel would fall under pagan influence and be swept away by the Assyrians. That's the northern kingdom. The result of this multi-generational failure is the enmity that we later see between the Jews and the Samaritans. Both groups represent the remnant of those 2 nations. The elements of the story that play itself out still today in the world and in the church are evident. The insecurity of the younger generation obfuscates their judgment. The assumptions of the older generation clouds their counsel. The younger generation assumes that they're not respected and that they deserve to be. The older generation assumes they are respected and deserves to be. In the meantime, their assumptions about one another and their unwavering belief that their assumptions are correct start dissolving the very foundations they're both standing upon. The saddest part about all of this is that both generations usually want exactly the same thing. They just disagree oftentimes on the details of how to make it happen. They usually just disagree about the minutia. You know, we're going to take up communion in just a second. But before we do that, at the beginning of the sermon today, I mentioned this book that was really important to me, Walking with the Wind. And I still marvel at the young people of the civil rights movement back then. And it so inspires me to read about the unique relationship that they had with the civil rights leaders that went before them. The chairman of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in its heyday, was a young man named John Lewis. And it was Mr. Lewis that wrote the book that I so love, Walking with the Wind. John Lewis died Friday at the age of 80. When I found out late Friday night, I immediately texted my best friend, and we took some time to reminisce about all that John Lewis wrote and what it meant to us. I'm rarely fazed by the deaths of famous people, but sometimes it feels like something more than a person is passing away. Sometimes it can feel like a legacy is dying, and it's a dying that we cannot afford. But that is the way of human institutions. They rarely survive the death of their founding members or heroes. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee didn't even survive into the mid-70s. Now, Jesus died so that the church would survive. Not just political and social persecution, by the way. He died so that his church would survive the potential of generational disunity and failure. John 17, verse 20 through 23 says this, "My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I in you. May they also be in us so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one. I and them, you and me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me." It was immediately after these words of his prayer that Jesus was arrested and crucified. And his church survives to this day. I think sacrifice must stand at the center of how we pass on the faith from one generation to the next generation. I think we each have to ask what we need to sacrifice to make that happen. We each have to hold on to what's imperative. We have to hold on to Jesus. And we have to be willing to sacrifice what isn't imperative. If this were a forum, we could debate what things fit into what category. But this is not a debate. This is just me talking to you. So for the purposes of today, and without the time to conduct such a debate, we need to walk away from this service understanding that the faith will only be passed on if each generation is willing to sacrifice something. As we now take up our communion, We need to think about what sacrifices to our worldview we might need to make in order to pass the faith legacy onto the next generation. Let's go ahead and pray. Father, thank you so much for today. Thank you so much for your son and for the way that he taught us to pass faith down from one person to the next through servanthood and through sacrifice. God, as we take up the bread, we remember the life that he lived and the way that he sacrificed for people, the way that he sacrificed from one generation to another, and the way that he connected across the board to people from all different worldviews, all because he was willing to be their servant. And Father, as we take up the communion right now, as we take up the wine, which represents the blood of his body, we remember the blood that he spilled for all people of every generation and all worldviews, God. I pray so much that we do a good job of putting Jesus at the center, and that we are able to release and let go of the things that are unimportant so that more and more people could know you, Father. We love you so much. Thank you for today. Thank you for our time together. It's in your son's name that I pray. Amen.